Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our Pride panel presentation for the Coalition for Aging LGBT. We would like to thank our sponsor, Texas Health Dallas, for providing us with this lovely space to host our panel in. Thank you. We would also like to thank our entire diversity action team. Thank you so much for working so hard at your individual entities to put this event together. We are so excited to see so many people online on Teams. And again, we really thank you all so much for joining us. All right, we are having some technical difficulties, so bear with us as we go. So we're good. Okay, thank you. So I am going to go ahead and introduce our panel today. So on our panel, we have Dr. Mann Hansen. Dr. is a part-time project manager with the Coalition for Aging LGBT, focused on volunteer and community engagement. Dr. is also an actor and a director acting on various stages in DFW. Thank you. He also owns Common Ground Games with his husband and is busy bringing queer movies to the Texas theater through Cinewild. Thank you, Dr., for being with us today. We appreciate you. We also have Majil Acosta. Thank you, Majil, for joining us today. Majil is a Dallas, Texas native. She attended SMU and became a teacher with AmeriCorps in 2011. Majil currently leads the organization as a senior manager director of core leadership and development and oversees the experience, leadership, and DE&I development of the network members in Title I schools across DFW. That's wonderful work. Thank you. Majil is passionate about changing stigmas around mental health, particularly in communities of color. Since 2019, she has worked exclusively with the Coalition for Aging LGBT's board, designing and facilitating strategic planning. We are so grateful for both of you and the gift of your time to Texas Health Resources today. And with that, we will turn this over to Dr. and Majil.
Thank you, Heather, Sonia, and everyone here for creating the space for us. We are delighted, thrilled, and humbled to be sharing space with you and to be presenting today on queer history and unconscious bias. So Majil and I had lots of conversations about what we wanted to share with you all today, thinking about you, our audience specifically. And something that the CFA for LGBT has been doing the past couple of years is doing a presentation on LGBTQ+ history. And so we think in order to truly care for the LGBTQ+ community in the present, in the now, we have to know and understand where the LGBTQ+ community has been, what we've endured, and what we've evolved from. LGBTQ+ history is not something taught in our education system currently right now, so it falls onto us to educate, to tell our own stories and to educate our allies. It's not unheard for me after doing this presentation to have an LGBTQ+ sibling come up to me and say, oh, I didn't even know that about my own history. So this isn't comprehensive. These are things that we don't even know with our own community. So it's important that we create the space, especially for someone who is caring, who is serving the community from a healthcare perspective. This timeline that I'm going to go through is in no way a full and complete look at the LGBTQ+ history. We recognize that many names, many organizations, many events are not included due to time restraints, and we encourage all of you to go home and fill in the gaps of this timeline. It's called Google. You use it for everything. Use it for your LGBTQ siblings now and fill in the gaps. I'm sure you'll learn something that I don't know. Come find me, tell me. I'd love to share our history with you and vice versa. This timeline includes sobering realities, ideas, and moments of pain, of pride, and of celebration. So we can begin with our next, oh, and implicit bias will be coming later with Majil. So also, happy Pride, everybody. Yay. We're so happy to be here. Yes, yes, yes. Real fast, the mission of the Coalition for Aging LGBT is to improve and protect the quality of life for older LGBT seniors in North Texas through coordination and collaboration for health, housing, advocacy, financial security, and social services. And we are now in the timeline. We're going to start in 1920, so a century ago. It's a good place to start as we are in the 2020s. So we'll begin with 1920. The LGBT term let me start over. I'm sorry. The 1920s, the iconic lesbian cafe, Eve's Hangout in Greenwich Village, is closed after a police raid. This period was rife with police going into LGBTQ plus safe spaces, predominantly bars at the time, and just shutting it down and taking the occupants into the paddy wagons, taking them to prison, putting their name and photo in the papers and basically outing them to the public. So to try to find a friend in that time period was literally taking your life in your hands because you could be arrested and shamed for all the world to see. And that happened to Eve's Hangout in New York. The New York Times is the first major publication to use the word homosexuality in the 1920s. So we're now seeing language being used to describe our community. In the 1930s, Dora Richer became the first known transgender woman to undergo vaginoplasty. So that's really exciting for our transgender siblings to see. This isn't new. This isn't something that's been happening. I know we're hearing this all over the news right now, but this isn't something that's been in existence for centuries. And Dora Richer was one of the people leading the charge, a trailblazer, you might say. We also have the Nazi rise to party in Germany, which we'll get to in a minute, but this was the beginning of a very, very, very dark time for our people. And electroshock therapy was being used widely in North America as a way to cure people of homosexual tendencies. And this is a very barbaric treatment. It has been talked against scientifically and in health services. It's still being used today, though, in some circles. So it hasn't gone away. It's definitely looked down upon, but it still exists, and it's very barbaric. The 1940s brings us to World War II. On top of the Jewish decimation, there was also an LGBTQ plus decimation. The Nazis targeted anywhere between 3,000 and 9,000 LGBTQ individuals and put them in concentration camps where they were suffered and eventually murdered. And while the murders may have ended when World War II ended, many of the liberated LGBTQ individuals were again imprisoned due to paragraph 175, a German law that criminalized homosexual acts. So approximately 150,000 individuals were freed from the concentration camps to then be imprisoned by their own government. There was no rest for these individuals. It was from one horror to a next horror. That's huge for us. That's something that still resonates within our community, and it's important that we know that as we move forward. People are still alive that suffered this, that experienced this. It hasn't gone away, and it's a part of who we are. 1940s also showed us the first prominent North American to reveal his homosexuality, the poet Robert Duncan. This occurred in 1944. Using his own name in the anarchist magazine Politics, he wrote that homosexuals were an oppressed minority. So we're starting to see advocacy in the 1940s for the LGBTQ community. So much of what you're going to see here is like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So it really is rife with, like I said, those moments of pain and suffering, and then pride and celebration. And that is one of them, Robert Duncan coming out and leading the charge, addressing the LGBTQ population being a minority. Then we go in the 1950s and we see someone like Andrew McCarthy and Roy Cohn start the Lavender Scare. I'm sure you all remember the Red Scare from history, where the US targeted alleged communists. The same thing were happening for LGBTQ individuals who were working within the government. So the Lavender Scare systematically targeted gay and lesbian individuals working within the US government in order to remove them from service by firing or forcing them to resign. The Lavender Scare came to an end in 1953 when President Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10450, barring LGBTQ individuals from working within the US government. So it really didn't do anything except prevent us from doing that. There were scientists in North America who all they wanted to do was serve their country. And they were prevented from doing so because of who they loved. So it wasn't a good thing. It was a complete, you just can't do it. You're not welcome in our government at all. In the 1950s, we also see more advocacy happening. The Mattachine Society is created in LA, possibly in response to the Lavender Scare. It was led by Harry Hay, and the Mattachine Society comprised of predominantly gay men who sought to combat isolation, create a homosexual culture in the vein of Black, Mexican, and Jewish culture, and assist homosexuals being persecuted and dominated against. Not to be the left out, the lesbians came and joined us with the Daughters of Bilitis. That was founded in San Francisco in 1955 by a lesbian couple, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon. You might remember them in the early 2000s. They were one of the first to get married in San Francisco. So we're talking about a couple that started lesbian advocacy and who finally got to get married 50 years later of not being recognized by their government. And the Daughters of Bilitis was the first national lesbian political and social organization in the US, offering support to isolated, married, and mothering lesbians. And they were also the first to participate in research, which is important to kind of be seen in this capacity, in a healthcare capacity, is to be a part of research. We are now in the 1960s, where we meet Bayard Rustin, an out Black gay man who was instrumental. He was one of the main organizers of the March in Washington. The march that brought us Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech only was possible because of the hard work of an out Black gay man, Bayard Rustin. He's a huge hero of mine. I love what he did. Even within that own community of working with the March of Washington, he was discriminated against. Many of the people who were working with him did not want him there because he was an out gay man. And that kind of begins the LGBTQ civil rights movement. And the first of that was Compton's Cafeteria in 1966. It was a riot that was led by transgender women in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. This incident was one of the first records of transgender riots in the United States, and it predates Stonewall, which we all know, by about 3 years. The Stonewall riots, which is kind of what we now know as the birth of the LGBTQ civil rights movement, was in 1969, and that was led by drag queens, transgender women of color, and young sex workers. They responded to a police raid. The police raids from 1920s were still going on. In 1969, the Stonewall Inn was a bar where police came in and they were illegally getting money from the bar to keep them protected. And the LGBT community, led by drag queens, transgender women of color, and young sex workers, finally fought back. And that started a 3-day riot in Greenwich Village, which became the clarion call for the LGBT community to rise up and start the civil rights movement. The 1970s brings us the first openly gay politician, Kathy Kozchenko, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. You might have heard of Harvey Milk, which we'll get to in a minute, but I think it's really important to remember that the first out, there were a lot of people that were in government that were closeted that came out later, but Kathy Kozchenko was the first individual who rallied and ran on a campaign platform where her sexuality was not a secret. I think that's pretty powerful that a lesbian was the one who was leading the charge within our own government. So kudos to Kathy for all of their hard work. I mentioned Harvey Milk. Unfortunately, his time in serving the government came to a tragic end in 1978 when he and Mayor George Moscone were assassinated for what we don't really know the reasons for it. But that was a tragic moment for us to see a young gay man leading in San Francisco in the political field be taken away from us. In 1979, we have the first national rights homosexual march to Washington, D.C. So just like the March on Washington, led by Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King and many other African-American civil rights leaders, the LGBTQ community had their own March on Washington in 1979. The 1980s brings a very dark time for us. It's the first cases of HIV and AIDS. It came about in about 1982 was when the first cases happened. President Ronald Reagan did not mention AIDS to the public for 3 years. That was 3 years of the LGBT community suffering alone, being forgotten about and discriminated against. Can you imagine right now, we're not even into 3 years of the COVID pandemic. Can you imagine Trump or Biden not mentioning COVID to the country? It's astounding to me to think that our leader in chief just sat by and watched an entire group of people be just die alone, and with only their community advocating for them. So that's a really hard time, especially now as we think about care for individuals. There's some There's some re-traumatization during the pandemic. The people who did survive the AIDS epidemic are now having to go back into isolation, and there's those feelings that they've been experienced from 30, 40 years ago are now coming back up. So it's a very real thing to consider within our community. 2 steps forward. Let's get out of the darkness a little bit. I purposely put this in here. Terry Sweeney is the first openly out comedian to be hired on Saturday Night Live. So yay, thank you, Terry, for bringing a little bit of humor in a dark time for us in 1985. The 1990s brings some more advocacy. It's, again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We see Don't Ask, Don't Tell is implemented. And this, 1993, Don't Ask, Don't Tell is actually ends Eisenhower's Order 10450, allowing LGBTQ plus members to actually work within the US government. However, it's a don't ask, don't tell thing. They'll let you work, you just can't tell anybody. So again, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But we're talking about a 40-year order that was in existence. So that finally ended in 1993. We get successful drug therapies. 3-TC, AZT, and DDC are shown to be effective treatments in HIV, finally giving us a light at the end of the tunnel. Those drugs helped create what we now have widely available to people living with HIV and AIDS, which helps us live in a space where it's not a death sentence anymore. You can live a long, full life if you are HIV positive with the drugs that were started and discovered in the 1990s. We also get the Trans Day of Remembrance. This was founded in 1999 by Gwendolyn Ann Smith, a trans woman who's a graphic designer and columnist and activist. She started this Day of Remembrance to memorialize the murder of Rita Hester in Massachusetts. Since the inception, the Trans Day of Remembrance has been held annually on November 20th, and it has slowly evolved from a web-based project into a national day, an international day of action. The 2000 brings us a bunch of LGBT hate crime protections. It also brings us the first permanent freestanding memorial in North America dedicated to the thousands of persecuted homosexuals from the Holocaust and World War II. That's the Pink Triangle Park in San Francisco. The 2010s brings us the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So we now have LGBTQ plus individuals working in the US government out and proud. There's no longer shame or secrecy around it. Very exciting. Obama also signed the Matthew Shepard and James Beard Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which added gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability to the federal hate crimes law, which is amazing that we also, the intersectionality of disability and LGBTQ+, that was all put into that same moment, which I think is really powerful to remember that discrimination isn't just held by 1 or 2 groups of people. There's so much in our culture and in this country that it's important to recognize all of them together when you're making that type of real and lasting change. And then we have marriage legalization in 2015, very exciting for us. And then again, 1 step backwards in 2016, 49 people were killed and 53 injured in a shooting in Orlando gay nightclub called Pulse. And that was June 12th in 2016. So 4 days from now is the anniversary of the Pulse shooting in Pride Month. So again, those sobering realities, those moments of pride, those moments of celebration, they exist. This is part of our history. And I think it's important that as you go into any space where you might be caring for somebody who identifies as LGBTQ+, that you remember what we've gone through and what we've experienced. I hope that helps. I hope that brings a little bit of light into this world. And I'm excited to share that with you. And I appreciate your time, your undivided attention, and very excited to, oh, hold on. I've got one more slide. Oops. Today, wow. Yeah, thank you. So marriage equality, non-discrimination protections, and trans visibility. Those are currently the issues that we're dealing with in advocacy and activism within the LGBTQ+ community. And it's because whenever we make those steps forward, there's religious reaction, legislative reaction that is brought against us. Last year, I think there were over 60 new bills in Texas alone that were written in order to discriminate against trans individuals. We are not out of the woods when it comes to advocacy and activism within our own community. Marriage equality was huge, but there are so many more things that we have to fight for that we're dealing with right now. So it's not over, and it won't be for quite a while, unfortunately, unless we can get the movement that we need and be recognized and remember where we've come from. I think knowing all these things that we do now will help us be a little bit more empathetic to how we go about engaging and treating LGBTQ plus individuals from a legislative point of view. I believe now we can move forward, Heather. If you have any questions about the CFA or have any interest in what we do, please go to our website, cfa.lgbt. We're also on Facebook. I have some material here for those in the room. If you want to come afterward, come talk to me. Happy to talk your ear off about what we do. So again, I want to thank you all for this amazing time that we created, your undivided attention. And I think it's important that as I hand the baton over to Majil, that we take a collective breath in this room and online. Let's just take a breath and marinate on what we just learned and prepare a space to be open to what we'll learn with Majil. So if you'll indulge me, let's take a deep breath in and out.
Yes. Thank you so much, DR. Can you all hear me? Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us. And again, that history is things that I didn't even know myself. So it's really good that we're spending the time to think about where we've been so that we can think about what we want to do moving forward in our allyship and in our commitment to the LGBTQ community. And so we're going to talk about implicit bias today. And let me be clear. We can do entire days of training on implicit bias. So right now, we're going to just get to the tip of the surface. And this is implicit bias, not just with the LGBTQ community, it's with any implicit bias we might have for any social group or any people in our community. And something I think you shared with me yesterday was the purpose of Pride Month. Do you want to share what you said?
Oh,
because
sure.
I loved what he said about that.
I think I'm very, I did that to be nice. Hi, hello again. I'll leave it on. So yeah, Pride Month, we don't own Pride. The LGBT community does not own Pride. I love that June is recognized as Pride Month, that we are here, and that corporations all over the world are starting to rally around us. But Pride comes in many different forms. Pride comes in who you are and how you identify through your gender, through your orientation, through your ancestry, through your race. Pride exists through all of this, and the intersectionality I think is really important, and especially for LGBTQ individuals. We can't do what we do without the help of our siblings of color, our trans siblings. We're all connected. Anyone that's being discriminated against, in my opinion, in this country can be put under that label of queer. So Pride exists for all of us. June might just be more for us, which is great, yay! But this is a time to be prideful, and I think as we go into this conversation with Majil, it's important to remember that.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. So yes, when we're thinking about implicit bias, it can be about any group of people. So like before we start talking about implicit bias though, today's titled Heart to Heart. And if we go into implicit bias, and that's a lot of, we're going to learn some things about it. If we go to that without actually thinking about why are we here? Then we miss that heart-to-heart connection, because the reason that we learn about implicit bias is because of how that can impact the people around us, the communities that we're serving. I know that THR is their mission statement is to improve the health of the communities that we serve. And that's all the community, which includes all of the different demographics. And so I want you to just take a moment right now and think about, why are you in this field? We're in the caregiving profession if you're working here. Why are you in this field, for you all in there? Why? What is your personal why? And just take one moment to think about that, because I want us to be grounded in that when we have the conversation about implicit bias. For those in the room, I'd invite you to maybe turn to someone really quickly and just share, say hi. I know we're about 6 feet apart, but why did you join this organization? Why are you here? Why, what's important to you? about doing this type of work. And I'll give us about 30 seconds. And I know that you all cannot interact with each other. However, maybe write it down. I think it's really important when we're convicted in our personal why, that actually drives the way we work every single day. And so maybe share with someone. I love it. Yeah. I love it. I love it. For those that are joining us virtually, if you could be here, you would be hearing a lot of people really connecting to serving the community and being really, really convicted by the type of work that we're doing in this hospital, this resource group. And so with that in mind, now that we've just grounded ourselves in our why, let's talk a little bit of implicit bias, because that is very connected. So why does it matter? Why does it matter that we learn about implicit bias? Outside of our why, we just talked about that, which is serving all of our community. Why it matters is because ultimately it can impede access to equity and opportunity. And when we're in the caregiving profession in healthcare, that can actually have really detrimental impact on individuals. And that's not something that from hearing what y'all said, and I can imagine the people that are here also joining us virtually, that's not probably why we're here. We're actually here to do the opposite, to give them access to great healthcare, to give them access to really great opportunities. And so it's important that we think about our biases because it can impact our actions, because our biases shape our action. Go to the next slide. And so what is implicit or unconscious bias? We've been talking about this now for about a slide. We use this term to describe when we have attitudes or stereotypes about a group of people that are unconscious to us, that we don't have knowledge of, that we don't really know. And so that's the implicit part, the unconscious part. If we're talking about the bias part is a preference or aversion to a group of people rather than it being neutral. So that's how we get the implicits, what we don't know, the unconscious. The bias is that preference or aversion. And let me be super clear before we go to that slide. I want to share something. We all have implicit biases. So this is not if I have an implicit bias. It's if I'm aware of the implicit biases I have. And so I want to make sure that when we're entering this conversation, it's not from a place of guilt or shame. It's actually our collective humanity is to have biases. However, we are empowered to make choices, to make those more aware, to make the unconscious more conscious so that we can take empowered action. And that's why we're here today, so we can also connect to that personal why that we just shared earlier today. And so let's talk a little bit more. How do we form implicit biases? And there's a lot of ways that we form it, but these are some of the three major ways that I want to share. Socialization is one of them. There's a cycle of socialization that begins at birth, where we take in things around us and we start making meaning of it, and it forms our worldview. Our personal experiences also inform our implicit biases, and of course, representations of groups of the media. And this is both representations or lack thereof representations of that in the media. And so what they do is they act as social filters where we make assessments or judgments about the world around us. And let me just give a little bit more on that. So our brains actually categorize and filter things around us all the time. That's part of how we make sense of the world around us. And I've read some about how if our brain didn't filter things out, then it would be in sensory overload. We wouldn't be able to process all around it. So it's actually part of our survival and how we live and in this world. So completely normal. I think if we're not aware of these associations that we're creating, if they're unconscious, then what can happen is they become wired in our brain and we don't even know that we're doing them. And then we create actions that might negatively impact others. And so today it's about trying to see what is underneath there a little bit and starting to explore that and just being aware that we have them so that we can then make different choices moving forward. And so how do they show up? There's lots of ways they show up. There's two ways that are kind of the main things you might see. Attitudes. And so these are evaluative feelings that you might have that are positive or negative about an individual or a certain group. It can also be stereotypes. These are traits that we associate with a category. And I want to share a very specific one, heteronormative bias. And this is a bias where it's relating to a worldview that promotes heterosexuality as normal or the preferred sexual orientation. And let me give you a quick example of that so it can come to life. One of my childhood friends, he is a gay man. And one time we were having a conversation when we were growing up, and he said, you know what I hate most is that when people ask me about my romantic partner, they always assume it's a woman. So they'll be like, do you have a girlfriend? Do you have insert feminine characteristic here? He's like, what I would love to hear from people is actually, what if they actually just asked, do you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend? Or if they use a gender neutral term, do you have a partner? Instead of assuming it's one or the other. And so that really, really stuck with me because I was just assuming that based on my own worldview and the way that I grew up, my own sexuality, that everyone else is that way. And that doesn't necessarily liberate others. He said it'd be so much more liberating if people would just not assume either way and just treat it as neutral because it doesn't have to be one or the other. And so I've started to do that. What's really interesting is I think what I've noticed, and this is just N of one experiment, is that people that are not heterosexual, they really love it. They're like, thank you for asking, But then I think, which demonstrates heteronormity even more, is that our heterosexual people that have asked this question, they might be like, oh no, I have a boyfriend, or trying to share that they are heterosexual because they're not even thinking about anyone asking them the other thing because their worldview is the dominant one. And so it's not a value add here. It's just to think about how do we actually think outside of our own worldview when we're interacting with other people to make it more inclusive for anyone, whether it's a patient, a colleague, or anyone that's in our community and that we work with and live with. So we're going to have a quick individual reflection. And I just want you to sit for a moment and think about this because we don't always get the opportunity to reflect. Part of this implicit bias is actually to think about and understand yourself more and your own biases and where they're at. And it takes reflection because we can't actually move to action until we are consciously aware of what's happening. And so think to yourself right now, what are some implicit biases that you might have? You don't have to share them with anyone, so don't worry. And then what's an example of when a bias has impacted your decision-making at work specifically? What impact did it have on others? I think we had talked about a couple of them. Do you want to, should we share a few that we've had?
I'm happy to share one that when I've done this work, when I started this work, these things came back in my memory as I reflected on it. And I used to work at a bank in New York. Quite often, I'm embarrassed to say that whenever a black man would walk into the bank, I would get defensive. I would be on alert. And I think that was because of what was portrayed in media. What I saw as the people that were robbing banks were black men. And so this was a judgment. I used my unconscious bias. It wasn't even me. It was just seeing the individual walk in and I was already defensive. So I had to learn to let the moment be the moment, let the person do their thing, come up and get a deposit, make a deposit, withdraw money. They're just living their lives. And there would be times when that bias would affect how I treated them in that moment because I was so nervous or scared for a variety of reasons. I have to own that up. That was the decision that I made. And so I've learned to overcome that on a daily basis. I have to, honestly, because of the country that we live in, I think. So it's not easy work, but when you start doing it, you start seeing people as a brother and sister, just living in this world, sharing space with you. And that has been very freeing and empowering for me personally.
Thank you for sharing that. I have one about the ANHPI community. I have a very close friend, she's one of my best friends, and I didn't grow up with a lot of Asian people in my life growing up. So I had my experiences were, I'm Latina, so I have a lot of Latinx people in my life. And I remember I didn't even notice, and I didn't even know I was doing this, but every time I went to an Asian restaurant, she's Chinese American, an Asian restaurant, whether it was Chinese or not, I was sending her pictures and be like, have you tried this? Tell me more about this, etc. And then one day she said, do you realize that every time you just assume that I'm like the spokesperson for an entire continent? And the thing about it is that people do that to Latinx and like Hispanics all the time. So it doesn't matter if you've also experienced it, you can also do it to others. And so it was just like oof. And it stings when you have awareness. It wasn't easy. And I felt so bad. I had a guilt trip and I apologized to her. And I said, it is not your responsibility to be the spokesperson for that. I'm sorry I've put you in that position. I don't want to tokenize you. And so, but being aware of it, I'm now more, I just makes me more aware of how I'm orienting to her and the things that I'm bringing up. And we can also, if we were to share other things, and we won't do that right now, but then if we were on the other side, what has been the impact of implicit bias on you? We all can say that, and we probably all have different things that we can share to just demonstrate the negative impact that implicit bias can have on individuals. Okay, and so I'm going to give you a quick resource. So what you can do is you can actually QR code that or put this in your phones right now or on your computer. It's either a QR code or the link, and it's bit.do. Make sure that it is, if you're doing the link and not the QR code, it is case sensitive. So THR must be capitalized. And it just has some types of biases. This is not exhaustive list, but these are just a resource that I want you to have so you can consider. And if you get a chance to just look at it, go ahead and start scrolling and maybe ask yourself, can you click? Yes. Ask yourself, how might these biases play out in your everyday work? And again, we all have them. So it's not if you have them, it's which ones do you have? And then, are there any of these biases that you might have regarding the LGBTQIA+ community? And so I'm going to give us just a minute to review them and to look at them. Again, we're just increasing our self-awareness. No judgment, but we need to be aware in order to be able to take empowered action. I think that for me, affinity bias is one where I project my own worldview or things that are clear to me. I think one time we had an exercise, and if you have time to do this, I think it'd be interesting. Write down your 5 closest friends or the people in your circle outside of your family. And just right next to it, write down some demographic information. What's their gender, their religion, their sexual orientation, their age, and just see if the 5 people who are the closest to you, is it the same? Is it similar? Is it affinity? And I think there's nothing. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with surrounding yourself with people that are similar to you. I think we find safe, brave spaces that way. But it can also indicate maybe there's areas in my life that I don't have as much personal or intimate knowledge of. Maybe these areas are ones that I want to explore. I want to get to know more, because ultimately it's not for the other. Honestly, the more people that you learn and the more that you connect to the diverseness of humanity, the better it is for you. Your life experience enriches significantly. And I think that especially in our country, we see how much divide we have. I think this is an opportunity for us to learn from each other and find more ways of finding just connection rather than difference. Okay, I'm going to move us along. Same document, if you scroll down there, the good news, I'm sure you're like, I have them, what do I do? Implicit biases are malleable. So it is okay. Just like they were wired in you, you can rewire them to have new connections in your brain. That's the beautiful thing about brain. I work in education. We talk about growth mindset. It's true. If we were stagnant, then I think we wouldn't be able to do all the wonderful things we can in this country, in this world. And so your brain is malleable and we can change that. And so there's been a lot of research that's been conducted on this. And again, this is the tip of the iceberg. So you're not going to learn a lot today, but if you scroll down the same document that you just looked at, there's 2 really simple ways that you can start doing that. And so I just want to send out an invitation for you all to start thinking about, how do I actively do that in my life? Not only for the benefit of others, but for the benefit of my own as well. And we're gonna, one more slide, and I want us to do this exercise. So we've been talking a lot about the history of LGBT today. We also talked about implicit bias and why we need to be just learning more about it and consciously gaining awareness. And so let's do this. This is anonymous, so no one's going to know who wrote this, but you can go, this is the new QR code. You can go to that QR code or go to that website, menti.com, and put in the code 3321932. Okay. And we have this broadcast at all of our, a lot of people across the network. And so what I want you to answer is, what are you personally committed to doing moving forward, specifically regarding implicit bias and the LGBTQ community? And we're actually going to show it. So as you start, we're going to give you a little longer to do it. Make sure everyone's on there, and then we're going to actually showcase your responses. Did people get the thing in here? Okay. Yeah, I think if you have it, we can, let's present and see what people wrote. Ooh, ask if you have a partner to be inclusive. Use proper pronouns. I love that one. Get to know individuals. Be more empathetic. Continue to educate myself. Contemplate my actions closer. Think before I react. Be aware of implicit bias in the work in advance. Love and listen. Love that. I advocate for myself and the community. And so you can keep them coming. And I think that is the end of our portion of our presentation. I know we have a little more left with you, but thank you so much so far for engaging with us on both the history and implicit bias. I love these, what people are sharing.
If I may, I'd like to do what I just put in here, and I'm trying to get better at this. It's just announcing my pronouns when I come into a space.
Yes.
So before this, let's rewind 47 minutes. Hello, my name is Dr. Hansen. My pronouns are he, him.
And hello, my name is Magilla Costa, and I'm she, her, ella.
All right. Thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate you. So now we have some time for a Q&A session. So for those of you who are virtual, you'll hear our Q&A here in Dallas. So if anybody has any questions, if you'll do us a favor, and you can raise your hand, but please raise your hand before you start talking, so that way we can get a microphone up to you so that they can hear you. So if anybody has any questions, okay, good. We have a question.
My question is for DR. Thank you for sharing your implicit bias. And I wanted to ask, do you guys have recommendations on how people can feel comfortable sharing their implicit biases? Because I've been in a lot of meetings recently where people have asked you to do it, but somewhat it's a private question. So how do you get over that hump, that hurdle of feeling comfortable enough in that space?
That's a great question. I think it to be vulnerable allows other people to be vulnerable, which allows true connection to happen. It's not easy. I didn't like sharing how I used to think when I worked at the bank. It was awful. But it was real. And the only way for me to overcome that is to address that. And if we're truly talking about safe and brave spaces, which we use, I actually don't think we can have safe spaces. I don't think that safe spaces exist. Safe spaces require me to know exactly what happened in your life in order for me to make you safe. I don't know how you're coming into this room. I don't know how I came into this room. I think safe spaces are beautiful. It's always the goal to have, but I don't think we can create those. They don't exist. What we can do is create brave spaces. Brave spaces where we create a space where I can share with you something that I'm embarrassed about, and you can receive that bravely. Or you can tell me, hey, when you said that, you can be brave enough to say, hey, when you said that, that bothered me. And I can be brave to listen. It's a two-way street. It's not brave in speaking, it's also brave in listening and receiving. So, and that's that brave space to me. I can see you, when you become vulnerable, I have to see you and listen. It's not a matter for me to talk. When you are speaking, my goal is to listen. We have 2 ears, 1 mouth.
That's to repeat them. We have got 2 ears to listen and 1 to speak. So when someone is talking, activate these to listen. Oh, we did not do that at all. I was on a roll too. Thank you,
You're doing
Heather.
wonderful, DR. You're welcome.
Thank you, Heather.
Lisa, keep going.
So that's, you have to take that space. And I think people, LGBTQ plus community, people of color, we just have to do that all the time. We have to navigate all that space. So it comes second nature for us. So I think it's just how I've been taught how to advocate for myself. And hopefully, if I'm doing the work, my advocating for myself allows people to advocate for themselves. It's not one or the other. We share the space together. So it's a long-winded answer. I hope that helps. But just do it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I like that.
Oh.
A brave space.
Also, because
Oh,
you get a flag.
she got the flag.
Happy flag.
That's lovely.
Does anyone else have any questions?
You just want the flag.
All right, so my question is actually for both of you. From a pronouns perspective, I put my pronouns in my signature for my email, things of that nature. So I just wanted to know is that, I guess from either Heather or Andrea, is there going to be maybe something from brand experience that will allow us, or can we?
Make sure that it's in the brand. It's front of mind for me to do that. I have it. I try. I've got it in my signature line as well. But I do need to start introducing myself with she, her, hers.
And then my question for our presenters here is, what recommendation would you have for leaders that, possibly new leaders, to create those break spaces, or whether it's in a huddle, whether it's in a team meeting, what are some recommendations or some key points that they can start utilizing in their everyday meeting?
That is a great question. Thank you for asking that. I think that the thing that sits with me is that if you're going to create spaces for others, you have to be doing the self-work too. So if I'm going to be, even to what was just asked, if I'm going to be brave and share my implicit biases, that means that I've also done some self-work so that I'm not as uncomfortable, because I've already understood that this is part of my journey and I am working through it so that I can then make it comfortable for others. Okay. So I think that's one thing. So we can throw techniques at it, but if that's not where we start with, like, the leader is leading by example and trying, and I think that can be hard for others to feel that with that. I think getting feedback a lot, not just feedback. I think we do in performance evaluation often, or in different organizations I've seen, it's been like, such grows, glows, and things, but let's have DEI feedback, or include that as part of the ways that we elicit feedback from others. How am I showing up in ways that are creating inclusive spaces for everyone to show up authentically? How am I ensuring that everyone's voice here feels like they have a voice and they can share regardless of their identity, especially if they're the minority in the group? And then model. So if I am committed to the liberation of people, I'm committed to everyone's liberation. I can't just choose whose liberation I'm committed to. So an example of this, as an ally, I have to be the one putting my pronouns first. So I don't have to, and I have to be leading with that first, because I want to make sure that people know that it is a space where you can do that. And so there could be there's trainings and like that, but I do think there's some self work. And then how do we also embed D&I, diversity, equity, inclusiveness, into even the ways that we work, the ways that we uphold and uplift each other, the ways we seek feedback, so that we can be growing. I have blind spots. You can do this. Your journey is for the rest of your life. To say that I'm never going to mess up, or and I do DI work all the time, and it's uncomfortable to have to sit there sometimes and oh, there's another blind spot that I didn't know, and I offended this person or this, but it's the more you do it, the more that you you learn that it's not about that moment. It's about how am I growing and evolving from each moment? How am I demonstrating that I'm also on a journey myself, and that journey is welcome for everyone. But we're not going to get there if I'm uncomfortable myself and then I don't make it, and then that translates to others. And I think I do believe that, especially in conversations across lines of difference, I think that's something that's often missing. We're so afraid to like mess up. You're going to mess up. Yeah. And but it's not about when you mess up. It's how do we recover and how do we continue working towards that? Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions in our audience today?
I have a question. Michelle, I just got a comment via text that your lipstick looks amazing.
Oh, thank you.
So that needed to be noted. But could you define ally?
Yeah. Sometimes I don't even like to say ally. I like to say aspiring ally, because ally is a bold statement, I think. And for those that are wondering about the lipstick, it's Maybelline. But I think I would say aspiring ally. And I think we're all allies for different peoples, groups of people. I think if I was going to define it simply, it's a commitment to curiosity, a commitment to growth, and a commitment to everyone's collective humanity. And so if I'm committed to that, my actions are gonna follow. And that doesn't mean perfection. That means I'm committed to it. So when I fall short, I can make sure that I do what's right and follow in line with my commitments. Yeah.
May I add to that?
Yeah.
I think what you just said is perfect because it goes into the action. I think it's really easy to throw that term around, and that's fine if you want to. There's no way that I can agree or disagree if you're an ally. If you're going to use that phrase, though, I think you need to know what that comes with, and that means action. And I think that action is used in spaces with people that look like you. It's advocating for people who don't look like you in circles of people who look like you. So when you're around your friends who look exactly like you and they use a racial slur or they misgender someone, it is your responsibility as an ally, if you're going to use that term, it's your responsibility to be brave and say, hey, buddy, hey, I know it's a joke, but I've got friends who've heard that joke from you before and they've told me they got really offended. If you're going to be an ally, and I just leave it at there. You don't have to go. I over talk sometimes, but just that type of moment. I think it's advocating for a marginalized group in a group that looks like you. It's not easy. It's really terrifying to do that because you might lose a friend, but that's not the point of that situation. If they might not really be a friend at the end of the day.
I agree.
So I think Majil, what she just said is absolutely spot on. I think it's important, but I think that action is really important as well.
I love that. And to add to that, inaction is also an action. So remembering that my silence is also an action. And so that's also part of the ways that we think about it. So thank you for adding that. I think that was wonderful.
I'm loud, wonderful. Okay, so it's kind of for a parent. Okay, so for the parents of our organization, what advice and/or recommendations would you give to them who are wanting to support their children and speaking to them about their sexuality? Are there any tools or resources that can help the parents and that can also maybe help us to give the parents or give the wires or anything of that nature?
Yes. That's a wonderful question. I think something I've heard a while ago is a lot of queer people aspire to be the parent that they never had. So as you're a parent, you can also look at it through that lens, thinking about being the parent that you didn't have possibly, but also thinking about what your child might want or need and trying to be that parent in the moment. I don't have kids. That's a choice, so I can't speak to it from my perspective. But as a queer person that did have parents who, it's been a rocky road for me personally, I'll be honest. I think it is education, and there are resources. On the top of my head, I don't know them. There are some, like I think Breaking the Binary or something outside the binary, Alok is a non-binary advocate who's written a book. I think it's a children's book. So I think starting with Google, that's the thing. You can do that. I know you want to talk to a queer person and get their advice, but you're empowered as an individual to do that work yourself. Go to Google. Look for children's books for parents with LGBTQ people. Amazon will pop up. You might not want to support them. That's your choice. But there are plenty of places that you can go to find these books. Target. I just saw Bayard Rustin was in a book at Target. I actually went through that page to be like, what'd they do? What'd they do? And they mentioned that he was out gay man. I was like, okay, good job. That you passed the test. So they do exist. But I think not reacting and creating that safe space and brave space for your child is really important. And remembering that children do have a sexuality. I know that's really uncomfortable. I might be kicked out of this room with it, but it exists. And if you're going to bring shame to it, you're teaching your child to have shame with their own body and their own sexuality. And in my opinion, that's not okay. I'm still unpacking that stuff that happened. And I know it wasn't purposeful. I know my parents didn't come in wanting that to happen, but our country does not know how to engage the human body and human sexuality. And it has to start with the parent, with your child. And I encourage you all to start. It's going to be uncomfortable work, but knowing that you're doing it, I guarantee you, your children are going to see you do that work. They're going to see you stumble, and they're going to be so grateful for it. They're going to love you so much more because they're seeing you do that work. And you all will figure this out together. I 100% believe that.
Okay, I want to thank everyone so much. For those of us that are on the virtual, I understand it's 1, so you may need to go. By all means, please drop off if you need to. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you. For those of us that are here in Dallas, please feel free to stay and interact with DRM Magil as long as you can.
Happy Pride!
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.